Nice Sunday morning, isn't it? Beautiful, really just a fabulous time of year. So glad that you're here this morning as part of your desire to know who Jesus is and how to follow him. That's who we are as a church, who we want to be. And so thankful that you're here and looking forward to the conversation that we're going to continue this morning. Since the very early fall, we use fall loosely. I know that this is really the first Sunday of fall for those of you who are technical about things, but we kind of started things strong, right? At the end of August with a study that we've called Turbulence. And we're talking about those times in our lives when things just go out of control. Times of loss, times of hurt, times of disappointment, times of disillusionment, and trying to understand what to do at those times in our lives and how to respond appropriately to them. We have some great friends. Lisa and I have some great friends visiting with us this weekend, and they're here with us this morning, and their names are Pat and Tracy Cross, and they're here in this service. They're friends who go way back, way before Walla Walla in our lives, and we've done ministry together, and they've ministered in Ireland, and they're working now doing ministry in Ogden, Utah. You can imagine some of the challenges of doing church ministry there. And they've been here this weekend. We've had a fun time just connecting with them. Well, Pat is a world-class runner, and one of his sons has followed in his footsteps. One of his sons, his name is Jordan, and he also is an elite runner. At one point in his senior year in high school, he had the fourth fastest mile in the country. That's 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Okay, so we're talking about some real fabulous talent. And as Jordan went on to college, things got complicated, and he ended up in a program with a lot of coaching turnover, and that wasn't great, and really wasn't maximizing his abilities. And then he experienced significant injuries and just has not been able to get the kind of traction that he needs until recently. He changed colleges. He's running now for Weber State in Ogden. And he's just finished 9 months of rehabilitation on his foot. 9 months of rehab. Has been slowly working up to the pace that he needs to be at. And he ran his first meet this fall, just a couple weeks ago. Then ran his second meet in Bozeman, Montana, and had actually shaved 40 seconds off of a 5-mile run. Shaved 40 seconds off, personal best, and kind of actually finding his stride and experiencing significant momentum in these abilities that God's given him. And so he's really been looking forward to next week when he gets to run in Notre Dame. Bozeman, Montana is like 5,000 feet high. He gets to run in Notre Dame next week, a nice flat course and a lot closer to sea level. And he's, an opportunity for him to really make his mark and establish a fabulous time. And been working hard towards that. Just the end of this week, a couple days ago, there was a tornado in Ogden. He and his teammates were outside trying to decide whether they ought to run in this wind or not. And the wind, a freak gust of wind, blew a tree branch out of the tree across a parking lot. All of his teammates around in one, and it lands on his foot. And doesn't break anything, but just tremendous bruising and a swollen foot. He's on crutches, and we don't know when I don't know what the scenario is from here on out. And just hearing Pat and Tracy tell that story made me think, man, that is turbulence, right? That's turbulence. That's what we're talking about. Now, you've probably never run a 4:10 mile and then had a branch fall on your foot, but you've had something else happen to you, and you know what that's like. You know what turbulence is like. Maybe not that exact kind, but you have your own kind of turbulence, and we all experience turbulence in our lives. We've said throughout this series, you're either in turbulence or just in between, and it happens. And the most important thing is how we view God. That's really the most important resource we have in times of turbulence, how we view God. And today, we're not going to talk exactly how to view God. We're going to talk about something that comes out of all the things we've talked about up to this point. All the things we've addressed up to this point, they all come together in the topic we're going to study today. And the topic we're going to study today, you're going to have no problem understanding this principle. It's so easy to understand. You will walk away with a full understanding of the principle. What's going to be hard is for you to implement this. It's easy to understand, but one of the toughest teachings in the Bible to implement. And my goal this morning is to help you implement it. I really want to help you get started in implementing this toughest teaching, one of the toughest teachings in the Bible, and one that will transform your relationship with turbulence. So, how's that for a start? Now, we have to begin, if we really want to get this teaching under our belt, then we've got to begin by acknowledging something that almost all of us do. Probably all of us do this. We measure God's presence in our lives and God's blessing on our lives, and whether or not our relationship with God is working or not. We measure those things by the amount of ease and comfort that we're experiencing in our lives. When things are going smoothly in our lives, we say, you know what? God is really blessing me. When things are going smoothly, we say, God is really working in my life, and my relationship with God is really working. But when things go south, when things go wrong, we say, you know what? God's far from me right now. God's far from me, and I'm not sure my relationship with God is working like it's supposed to. And I'm not sure the gospel is working for me. In all honesty to you this morning, I have used those very words. A couple summers ago, I was on the roof of my house. I'd been painting all summer long. My job was to paint the exterior of the house. We were remodeling the house and getting a lot of things done. And my job was to paint the outside of the house. I'd been working all summer long. And every spare minute I've been working on this house. And you know that when you're painting your house, you actually don't pick up a paintbrush till like the very end. So I'd been sanding and priming and caulking and all those things. And finally reached a point where it was time to actually begin painting the house. And I got up, it was going to take me a couple big long days. I got up early one morning. I climbed out onto my roof so I could paint my second story. And I kicked a bucket of paint over on my roof. It was a brand new roof, 40-year shingles. We just put it on as part of the remodel. And I kicked over this bucket of paint. Didn't end up spilling the whole bucket, but a significant bit of paint all over my roof. And I said something when I was on the roof. First, I threw some things off the roof. I was so mad. I just threw them across the yard. I threw them off the roof. I was so mad. And I said some things. And one of the things I said was, the gospel is not working for me. Pastor Brad said, the gospel's not working for me because I spilled paint on my roof. Do you understand the problem behind that way of thinking? I don't know if you've ever said anything like that. Maybe not those exact words, but I'll bet you've said something that reveals the same kind of assumption that we operate with as Jesus followers. That's flawed, it's wrong, and it says this: the goal of the gospel is my smooth life. God's vision for me and my life is that things go well. That's God's vision for me. That's what walking with God and being His child is all about. Having life go well for you. The goal of the gospel is my smooth life. Now, is that the goal of the gospel? Is that God's vision for your life? Is that what walking with God and being His child is really all about, that things would go well in your life? Is that God's greatest vision for you? It's just that your life would be nice and smooth and that you wouldn't have any big problems? Is that what it means to walk with God? That at least when you're walking with God, you don't have big problems? Or if you do have big problems, at least they don't last very long, or they get solved miraculously. That's what walking with God is all about. Is that the goal of the gospel? I'll save you the trouble. That's not the goal of the gospel. It's not God's vision for your life. God's greatest vision for you is not that everything just goes smoothly in your life. God's vision for your life is not your comfort. God's vision for your life is your Christ-likeness. It's making you in your thoughts and attitudes and your behaviors and your actions more and more like His Son, Jesus. That's God's vision for your life. We touched on this last week when we looked at Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son. The ultimate goal of all these things that God is doing in our lives is it would be like Jesus. So what that means is that God's vision for your life is not your comfort. It's your Christ-likeness. And this distinction is really, really important because what produces one doesn't usually produce the other. What produces your comfort does not usually produce your Christ-likeness. And what produces your Christ-likeness rarely produces comfort in your life. Actually, your Christ-likeness is preeminently formed in the crucible of hard times. And when you recognize this, when you recognize that the goal of the gospel is not your comfort, it's your Christ-likeness, and when you recognize that turbulence can produce Christ-likeness like nothing else can, that changes everything. That changes your relationship with turbulence. It changes how you feel when you go through hard times. It changes how you respond when you face hard times. It changes the effect that turbulence can have on your life. And it helps you implement one of the most important and difficult teachings in the Bible. And those are big promises to change your whole relationship with turbulence, help you implement one of the toughest teachings in the Bible. So let's see if we can get there from here. Take your Bibles, open them to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. This is the book of James. Something that you'd want to know about the book of James is it was written by James, but there are a number of different men named James in the New Testament. This book was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. And what's interesting about James is that as Jesus' brother, he was not a Jesus follower. He did not become a Jesus follower until after he'd seen the resurrection take place. After he'd seen Jesus crucified and then later met him in person, that's when James became a Jesus follower. He was skeptical. That's just my brother. And then at the resurrection convinced him. You see in the early church in the book of Acts, James rises to a position of leadership in the early church. That's who James is. First he was a skeptic. The resurrection convinced him to become a Jesus follower. Seems like we heard a story like that last week about Paul. Well, here's what he writes in James chapter 1. I was talking and not opening my Bible. Verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Let's just work our way through that. The first point is where you kind of stub your toe. I mean, it's the very first statement. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. The command in this passage, the command to you and me as Jesus followers is this: change your mind about turbulence. Change your mindset about turbulence. And that's why I say this is one of the toughest teachings of the Bible. Consider it pure joy. It's not hard to understand, it's just hard to implement. And James sets the bar pretty high when he says, consider it pure joy. The idea here is that your translation might say, consider it all joy. All right? The idea here is as pure, undiluted joy. It's joy that is not diluted by any competing thoughts or feelings. It's just like joy. Not 50% joy and 50% grin and bear it. Not 80% joy and 10% resentment and 10% grin and bear it, but like 100% undiluted joy. Respond with undiluted joy when you face all kinds of trials. One translation says, I think this is helpful because it helps me hear it in a different way, consider yourselves fortunate. Consider yourselves fortunate when you face all kinds of problems. Actually, the translation says, consider yourselves fortunate when all kinds of trials come your way. Now, that's a mindset change, right? I don't know about you. For me, that's a mindset change. I do not consider myself fortunate when all kinds of problems come my way. But that's what James says we're supposed to do. We're to consider ourselves fortunate. When? Well, when you face trials of many kinds. When you face trials of many kinds. Or as that other translation, consider yourselves fortunate when all kinds of trials come your way. When I was a kid, I memorized this verse from the King James Version. So the King James Version was written and translated around the time of Shakespeare. And so it's got some old English words in it. And this verse in the King James Version that I memorized says this: My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. And I thought, divers temptations? What kind of temptations does a diver have? And are we talking about scuba divers or people who dive off of diving boards? I mean, I was a kid trying to figure out what kind of temptations do divers have? Well, you just add one letter to the word divers, you add an E to the end, and you get the word diverse. And that's the word. Count it all joy, undiluted joy, when you fall into all kinds of trials and temptations. You might paraphrase it like this: consider yourself fortunate when you face each and every kind of trial. Here's what's significant here. There's no distinction between good trials and bad trials. There's no distinction between trials that God allowed and trials that just happened to you randomly. There's no distinction. There's no distinction between productive trials and unproductive trials. They're just all grouped together. They're all grouped together. There's no distinction because every trial that comes to us, all turbulence we learned a couple weeks ago, is filtered by God before it reaches us. So there's no distinction. All trials, all problems, all challenges. A trial then can be anything that challenges you, anything that stretches you, anything that disturbs you, anything that makes you want to, that challenges your obedience or challenges your desire to keep persevering. Anything that makes you think, I want to quit, I don't believe, I don't want to go the way that God wants me to go on this, or I'm resentful, anything like that. So we're talking about money problems, we're talking about marriage problems, we're talking about health problems, we're talking about job problems, we're talking about leaky pipes in your house. I mean, we're talking about all those things, each and every kind of trial. Consider it pure, respond with undiluted joy. James says, listen, you need to change your mind about turbulence. That's my big idea this morning, really. We're just going to say that 100 times in different ways. Change your mind about turbulence. You need to change how you think about turbulence. Instead of getting upset or panicking or resentful towards God, we need to consider ourselves fortunate. Consider ourselves fortunate. Turbulence is a gift. Turbulence, this thing we've been talking about, saying here's how you get through it and doesn't it hurt, and it's a gift. And it's a gift because God uses it in our lives to make us more like Jesus. That's what verses 3 and 4 say. Why do we respond with joy? Because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance develops maturity. And so James says, listen, turbulence is part of a chain. It's part of a process that God wants to use in your life to make you mature and complete. Who doesn't want to be mature and complete? So James says, that's why you respond with joy. Now, just in case you think James was a little bit, he was a little bit masochistic, and hated himself and must have had a bad self-image. Paul says the exact same thing, very similar words in Romans chapter 5. This is what Paul says. We also rejoice. Now stop there. Rejoice. Consider it joy. We also rejoice in our sufferings, turbulence, trials of each and every kind. We rejoice in our sufferings. Paul, different person, says the same thing. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character. Character, hope. Exact same idea. We rejoice in sufferings because sufferings produce something in us. They make us more like Jesus. So we consider ourselves fortunate. We got to change our mind about turbulence because hard times refine us. Suffering makes us stronger. Specifically in James, suffering produces the ability to persevere. Going through hard times makes you stronger so that the next hard time doesn't knock you down. It develops the ability to persevere. It builds endurance. It builds greater trust in God so that you're exhibiting a whole different level of trust in God when you're going through a hard time. If I have someone say, oh man, I'm really trusting God right now. He's just so good. And everything in life is going like this. And someone else who's going through serious hard times says, man, I'm just really trusting God. I know He's good. And they're like going, their life is doing that. I'll tell you what, this means a whole lot more to me in terms of the amount of confidence and faith in God that it takes to trust Him. There's a lot more faith that's being exhibited here than in the life of the person where everything is going smooth and says, I just trust that God, He's so good. Someone on their deathbed, they say, God's so good. That's a whole different story. The testing of our faith develops perseverance. And this was even true, you might be surprised to know this is even true for Jesus. There's a statement, just a short little statement in Hebrews 5 that says this. It says, Jesus is the subject, He learned obedience from what He suffered. Now we think of Jesus as being perfect, sinless, and He was. So what does it mean that He needed to learn obedience? Here's what I think it means. I think it means that as Jesus was growing up from a boy to a young man to an adult, that He obeyed at each level in increasingly difficult circumstances. All right? He had the chance as a 5-year-old to obey, and He did. And that developed in Him the ability to obey as a 12-year-old. And as challenges and the level of hardship increased, as suffering at increasingly challenging levels gave Jesus the opportunity to develop new levels of obedience, new levels of trust in the Father, develop increasingly impressive and perfect obedience so that He was ultimately ready to take on the level of suffering that would be required in dying on a cross to win salvation for us. He learned obedience through increasingly challenging levels of hardship. And it's not any different for you or me. We're not going to get obedience any easier way than Jesus got it, for sure. It's not any different for you and me. It's through hardship that God does His greatest work in our lives. And we know that this is true in every area of life. That's why James says, listen, you know the testing of your faith produces. You know this. You already know this. It's a life principle that we get stronger through hard things and not through easy things. Nobody goes to the gym and says, yeah, I'm working on being stronger. I lifted a whole lot less weight today than I did yesterday. Nobody goes to the weight and goes to the gym and practices lifting less and less to get stronger. Nobody goes running and tries to run slower and slower and slower to get better. Okay? We know this. You know it's a life principle. We don't get better at things when they get easier. We get better at things when they get more difficult. Hard times produce growth way beyond easy times. You might wish it wasn't true, and I might wish it wasn't true, but it is true. And because it's true, because God uses hardship and suffering to make us more like Jesus, when we encounter turbulence, we consider ourselves fortunate. Now, I want you to think of the turbulence that you are in the middle of right now, or the turbulence that you're afraid is right around the corner. I want you to think, wow, when I encounter that, I consider myself fortunate because God is working in my life. We rejoice because God is working on us. He's working on us, and if we respond correctly, we will emerge more like Jesus. Let me go off script here a minute and say that's one of the reasons we need each other. I need you to remind me sometimes, hey, James 1, remember that sermon you preached? You can say that to me in the right, not the first. I don't want that to be the first thing you say to me. But you can say that to me. And hopefully I can say that to you, that not that we don't listen to each other, share our problems. That's part of loving each other. But we also help each other come around to a point where we can consider it undiluted joy because God is giving us the opportunity to become more like Jesus. If we will respond properly to this turbulence, you can respond improperly to turbulence and become less and less like Jesus. We need to say that. But you can also respond properly to turbulence, and when you do, you become more and more like Jesus. So turbulence is a gift because God uses it to make us more like His Son. And it's actually one of the ways God carries out Romans 8:28. We talked about that last Sunday, how God works all things for good. One of the ways that God jujitsus and turns the table on cruel and evil events is by using those events in transformative ways in our lives. That's one of the ways that Romans 8:28 is fulfilled in our lives. By God using it to make us more like Jesus. Think how frustrating it must be for Satan when his best efforts to destroy you actually end up making you more like Jesus. That would make me want to quit. So you are not the victim of a cold, cruel world. You are not the victim of random events. Jordan is not the victim of a random event when a branch flew out of a tree and out of everyone in the parking lot it lands on his foot. He's not the victim of a random event. That could have been Satan trying to destroy him. I'm not saying that God did that. What I'm saying and what the Bible teaches is that God can use that despite where it comes from to help him become more like Jesus, and the same thing is true for you. And the same thing is true for me. I love this quote by a pastor from a previous generation. His name is Alan Redpath, and he talks about this idea, and this is what he says. There is no circumstance, no trouble, no testing that can ever touch me until, first of all, it has gone through God and past Christ right through to me. If it has come that far, it has come with great purpose, which I may not understand at the moment. I love that. I love where he says, if it has come that far, it has come with great purpose. That's why we kind of needed all these previous Sundays to help us properly understand this teaching. Because we talked about how God protects us. We've talked about how God knows exactly where we are. He is always where we are. We've talked about the God who never sleeps. How God watches over you and never sleeps and guards you and protects you from harm. And if this God has allowed this turbulence in your life, you can know that He wants to use it for good. And that one of the ways He wants to jujitsu evil is by making you more like Jesus through it. So, consider it pure joy Change your mind about turbulence. Don't fear it. Don't resent it. Don't dread it. Don't measure God's presence in your life by the lack of it. God has bigger fish to fry in your life than making you comfortable. He wants to make you more like His Son. So when you encounter turbulence, you're encountering one of God's finest tools and one of your best growth opportunities. So change your mind about turbulence. Turbulence is God at work in your life. Turbulence will move you faster, closer to maturity than anything else. So you change your mind about it and you respond appropriately to it. And here's the thing. When you know that all turbulence goes through God and all turbulence is a gift from God, you can also know this. You have what you need to go through this turbulence. God's not going to let you experience something in your life that you are not equipped with, that you are not equipped to deal with. So you have God's Spirit in you. You're equipped. You have God's people around you who love you and want to support you. You're equipped. You have God's truth to go to give you insight. You're equipped. You have what you need. And according to this passage, one last little morsel from this passage is you can have one other thing if you feel like you need it. If you're like, I am not ready for this turbulence, I need more, well, you can have more. That's what James says. He says, listen, if any of you lack wisdom. Now that's right here. It's the very next verse. It's all one passage. If you're in turbulence and you lack wisdom, ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. You need wisdom. You don't have what you need. Ask God for it. He's generous. He'll dole it out in lavish proportions if you just ask Him for it. So you have what you need. You have everything you need to face turbulence with joy. I have everything I need to face turbulence with joy. Now, we said at the outset, this is easy to understand, hard to do. You feel that now, right? You're like, I get it. Okay, well then do it. Well, that's hard. Right, I'm with you. We get it. We understand this. Now the challenge is to live it. And I just want to give you a couple things that I think will help you take a step towards putting this into practice. Just take us a minute. 3 steps and then a bonus. Okay? 3 steps and a bonus. Step number 1, I think, will help you face turbulence with joy is to just thank God for it. I really mean thank God for your turbulence. You tell God, I know that this has come through you. It doesn't mean God did it to you, but it means it's come through Him. I know this has come through you, and I thank you for this, even though I don't really like it, because I know you're going to use it to make me more like Jesus. Wow. That will start changing your mind towards turbulence if you can thank God for it. If you can do this, you've already made a big mindset change. So you thank God for it. I mean, and I've had a chance to practice this a little bit. I knew this was coming up. I knew I had to get a little bit better at this. I've been working on this. And it helps you just think about it differently. So you thank God for it. Ask for wisdom in it. Ask for help in it. We're told we can do that here in James. We can ask for help, and then you'll have what you need. So you're going to ask for wisdom. You're going to thank God. You're going to ask for wisdom. Now, here's a hard one. Now you're going to change your mind about it. You're really going to change your mind about it. And I challenge you to do this. Think about your turbulence and smile at the same time. That probably sounds pretty corny to you. I just dare you to try it. You think about your turbulence and you smile at the same time. And that congruence of happiness and your turbulence at the same time, I think God will use that to help you change your mind. God will use that to help you rejoice. Because we want to just carry this, we want to carry this out, not just know about it, right? So if you want to carry it out, try that. Think about your turbulence and smile at the same time, because God's going to use it to make you more like Jesus. And then the bonus, it's not in your notes, but it's this. Keep obeying. You got to keep obeying. If you really want God to use this turbulence in your life, you don't give up now. You don't just be happy and I'm happy about this and I'm going to quit doing what I know I'm supposed to do. No, you keep obeying. You keep leaning into obedience, leaning into following Jesus. You look at this as an opportunity to develop new strength, new endurance, and that's one of the ways that we follow God in times of turbulence. We don't just trust Him and say, I know this is going to work out for good sooner or later, but we actually respond with joy. And I hope that this helps you take some steps towards this. You got to keep these notes with you. If you're in the middle of it and you need to rethink this, look at James. Keep reading James. Practice some of these things we've mentioned this morning and see if God won't enable you to be able to face turbulence with joy. I want to give you a minute, and I want you to take 1 or 2 or 3 of these things, thanking God, asking for help, thinking about your turbulence and smiling. I want to give you a chance to actually do that for a minute. So we're going to all bow our heads and close our eyes so we don't see each other smiling about turbulence. And I want to give you just a moment. Take a little baby step in implementing one of these things today. All right? Will you do that? And I'll give you just a minute to do that, just you and God. Father, right now we are trying to be obedient to what you teach us. Right now, we're wanting to obey you. We're wanting to respond with joy to some turbulent things in our lives. And as your sons and daughters here this morning take this step, I pray that you will give them joy. You will give them the assurance that you're with them and you're going to use their turbulence for good in their lives. I pray that you will help build this quality in all of us. We need this. We want to follow you with joy, and we have every reason to respond to turbulence with joy because we know you watch over us all the time. So God, help us. I pray for this faith family that you will help us in this way, that you would make us more joyful and resilient, so that as a result, we are persevering and obedient. And that we would become more and more like Jesus. That our lives, our character, our priorities would more and more reflect your true heart. And that as a result, this valley would be impacted because of it. We ask it through Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Good stuff.